I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. So on a recent episode of Alice's podcast, Poetry Says, she mentioned this term queer baiting, and it was in the context. She was talking about Taylor Swift and concerns about queer baiting. I am not going to weigh in on this question, but it did clarify for me a point that comes up a couple times during this episode. So I recorded an episode with Cameron about the gayness of Shakespeare and questions surrounding this point. And in it, I said that there's something that to me feels almost fundamentally gay about poetry, or if not gay, then like that in the context of poetry, gayness seems like a non-issue, like something that's almost just like part of the terrain. And we talk a little bit in the second part about why there may be sort of a disproportionate number of gay poets, but the question that I wasn't able really to put a finger on was why it is that poetry feels sort of natively gay to me. But Taylor Swift actually clarified this for me. So my understanding of the controversy is this. Taylor Swift is the biggest pop icon in the world. She is a woman who dates men. I don't know how many of her fans are like straight men hoping to get with her. Like, I'm not sure that's exactly how she appeals, but the theory is that some of her songs, some of her presentation, paraphernalia, whatever, may signal gayness in various ways. I have no interest in diving into the details of that, but the idea is that they may be suggesting to young gay women that Taylor Swift is herself gay, and therefore, I guess, extending false hope to them. It feels like a little bit of a shaky theory to me. Just on not on the basis of Swift's sexuality, which I have no idea about or interest in, but on the basis of like whether or not people who are listening to a pop star's music are really genuinely believing that they may have an identitarian chance with that person. Anyway, the idea of queer baiting clarified for me an impression I'd gotten from a couple of, so I do now listen to a fair amount of Taylor Swift's music because of my daughters, and I have noticed a couple of funny things in some of the songs. So in one, for example, she seems to be talking about a man that she has some sort of connection with, but then in the refrain, she compares him to James Dean and herself to Brad Pitt, which is, it's like a little bit startling if you're listening to a song about a man and a woman. But it sounds good in the song, so why not? And then in another song of hers, I noticed that the refrain seemed to be sung by a voice that to my ear sounded either like a man's falsetto or maybe like, and I, say this with all respect in my own ignorance, but it sounded to my ear like a trans voice. And I may be thinking specifically of like the lead singer of Antony and the Johnsons, but I looked up who was singing that song because it was such a strange juxtaposition with her own voice. And I didn't find out who was singing it, but I did find out who wrote the song, or who, co-wrote the song. And it was a man. This brought home what I think some of the basic gayness of poetry. And this is that we're writing in different voices. That like back to Plato's Ion, even experts in poetry have long conflated the singer of the poem with the author of the poem. When you have what's his name from Hootie and the Blowfish had a big hit a few years ago with Wagon Wheel. That song was of course written by Old Crow Medicine Show, but it was his hit when it made it big. Similarly, the white guy who recently had a hit with the old Tracy Chapman song. People made a big point of how it was her song, and she, of course, became extremely famous on it on her own merit, or in her own time. But then it was a new hit under his name. And if you look at country music, like there's a long tradition of it usually goes only one way. It's usually women singing songs originally sung by men, but they will typically leave the pronouns as they are, so that women will sing The Long Black Veil, which is about a man who has an affair with his friend's wife. So part of what struck me as just basically gay or queer about poetry is that we're all borrowing and trading voices. I had the same experience reading through some of the poems, my favorite poems from. I always dog ear the poems that are my favorite from a collection, and then I go back and I'll often transcribe them later. So I was transcribing my favorites from Hardy's Selected, and I came back to this poem called The Pine Planters, which is just gorgeous. It's just a beautiful, heartbreaking poem about two people planting pine trees, and one of them is desperately in love with the other and knows that the other will never return that love. Now, when I first read it, it seemed to my somewhat skeptical eyes to be a gay love poem. That is, it was spoken by somebody doing manual labor with a man in love with that man, and the speaker's name was Marty. I then later, looked it up, and I found out that Marty was the name of a female character from a Hardy novel, and that this was spoken in her voice. She was doing manual labor with this man. But either way, it's a very typical move in poetry that kind of there's a real fluidity of speaker. So I have no interest in Taylor Swift's sexuality, but I do think that at least part of what seems to happen is that she collaborates with people, right? Whether those people be other singers or other writers, and they bring in their own perspectives and their own impulses and their own desires. So even in a theoretical world in which everybody involved was straight, you would still end up having these sort of implicitly gay themes coming out. So at any rate, that was what I think was helpful to me to recognize after I finished recording this episode. But for now, I did have a lot of fun talking with Cameron. I'm generally somebody who does not care one way or the other about the private lives and sexualities of authors. But this ended up being a pretty interesting conversation about Shakespeare's sonnets in particular, and about a couple of articles on the subject of his gayness and how we might think about that, and whether we should think about that, and whether we should get angry about it. You can imagine my opinion on at least some of that. So here's my conversation with Cameron about how gay Shakespeare was. All right, so Gay Shakespeare.
Gay Shakespeare.
You brought this up, and you sent a couple of articles. And then in the articles, they talk about a number of poems. So I marked those poems. This is with a couple exceptions. This is mostly just about the sonnets, really.
Yeah. This is all about the sonnets.
Yeah, there are a couple little scenes they cite from the plays that mostly are like. There's a scene in Much Ado, I think, where the question is like, is it fair to read a sonnet as a sign of somebody's genuine feelings, and like, if the plays are to be believed, like at least somebody in one of the plays says that. But I think, as you've pointed out plenty of times, it doesn't take much. Like, any thoughtful reading of Shakespeare's plays makes it very clear that like you cannot derive his opinion from them.
No, I stand by.
Yeah, the sonnets do seem to be really like, if there is an indication of his personal feelings, then that's probably only to be found in the sonnets.
Yes.
If there, but yeah. So I found much to be amused and annoyed by in both of these articles. But yeah, so do you want to present what this is all about?
Well, I was reading Shakespeare in bed one night, as you do. I was reading the sonnets, which are very beautiful things.
Yeah.
And I was just reading one, and I was like, isn't this insane that like I'm reading this sonnet and I know like the first 100 and it was 126, 129, the first 120 something are about like a man. And yet like no one says this. Like no one talks about this. Like, yeah, people do talk about this, but like not that much. Like I think insanely less than like one would expect. I mean, even compared to like people write about Hart Crane's Voyages as like a great gay poem. But like Shakespeare wrote 129 of them. And I was just reading it, I was like, well, maybe I'm wrong. Let me go on the internet. And I went on the internet. And instead of finding like discussions of like Shakespeare's 129 gay ass poems, I found like discussions of how like people claiming Shakespeare was gay is somehow like presentist and doesn't understand like time and stuff. And then I went down like a whole rabbit hole of like all the ways in which people have attempted to claim that Shakespeare isn't gay, which was like hilarious and very, very fun. But yeah, this is what sort of like pissed me off, basically. Which like we're now at this point. So I sent you two articles. One, which is like argues all the points in favor that Shakespeare's gay, and one which isn't really interesting because it's a report on like an argument in the TLS, but like has like just a hilarious comment section. There's just so full of like right-wing people saying hilarious things that I thought was just like just entertainment for how stupid people are.
It did feel a lot like the Harold Bloom thing, where like, oh, I wasn't really worried about Emily Dickinson being gay, but like now that you're real, like now that it's so important to you that she not be gay, and now I'm confused.
Yeah,
Like what? Why is this?
yeah,
Like it does seem to be like the real spectacle here was a an older critic saying like, hold on a minute, don't call him gay. And it's like, whoa, what? Why is this a thing you're yelling about? Sir Brian
yeah.
Vickers, a visiting professor at University College London, began the row by condemning a book review which suggested Sonnet 116 appears in a primarily homosexual context. In a letter to the Times Literary Supplement, this is Sir Brian Vickers, he said the claim was anachronistic because scholars now accept there were forms of rhetoric that allowed men to express love without implying sexual attraction. He also said that any attempt to find biographical information in the sonnets was doomed because Shakespeare was a professional who wrote under the identity of a poet persona. In Shakespeare, Sonnet 116, it's Joshua Megan's favorite. I think he said that. I mean, it's one of the most celebrated of his sonnets, of love poems. I recited it at my sister's wedding. It's recited at many a wedding. Very quickly, it's let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark, which looks on tempest and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. And, if you were unsure, he does, the last line is, if this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. And I have heard it argued that no man is often used just to mean no one, which like, sure, but sure. Okay. But yeah, apparently the review said this appeared in a primarily homosexual context, meaning that the sequence of the sonnets as a whole was primarily homosexual, and this was what Vickers got so up in arms about, and then lots of other people had lots of other things to say.
Yeah, so I think Vickers' argument is why I like to call bullshit squared, because I think there's bullshit in the beginning of it and there's bullshit in the end of it.
Right.
So he says,
analyze the bullshit for us, please.
Remind me of the phrase again. So he says, we're being anachronistic.
He calls it anachronistic because scholars now accept that there were forms of rhetoric that allowed men to express love without implying sexual attraction.
Right. So this is stupid for many reasons. Most of literature is gay as fuck. The Greeks are really fucking gay. Like the Symposium is just like men loving men, and then like occasionally there's women in it.
I was going to say occasionally they're like, mostly they're not quite men. Like one wishes the Symposium was just gay. It's more uncomfortable than that because they're mostly like on the edge of puberty.
Right. But like what fascinates me is that like no one talks about like just how fucking gay and like also like weirdly gay and like problematically gay, sure, like just like how in love with men the Greeks are. Like Greek culture is so misogynistic, it's insane, but it's also extremely homoerotic, and like both of those things, like one seems to come at the price of the other. But like it's fascinating that like no one ever told me, but like the Plato Symposium was not like a treatise on heterosexual love until I just read it, and I was like, oh shit, okay.
It's real. It is like it's jarring when you read like how much it's about like sticking your dick in between the thighs of little boys, not little boys, young
like teenage boys,
like uncomfortably young boys.
It's weird because the Greeks are very weird in a way that I find much more interesting than the Romans, who seem
similar. Yeah, I'm very much
weird and dumb.
The same feeling. Yeah. Though unlike you, I do love Horace and Catullus. So another episode.
So there's a long history of like men being in love with men, But also, is it Brian? Is his Vickers? Brian? What's his
Vickers,
name? What's his name?
Sir
Yeah,
Brian Vickers is Sir, like that's, I know,
yeah.
like
Someone.
people, like it's more important there that you have to say that than it is here, I guess.
Oh well, I mean, I don't give a fuck. But yeah,
Sure.
someone knighted him for something.
Yeah.
Hopefully not for his opinions on Shakespeare, but yeah, someone knighted him.
And is
Um,
that separate, just for our ignorance or my ignorance?
yeah,
That's separate from being a peer. Like there's big being a peer.
yeah,
Being peer, of course, means in Britain like the opposite of what we think of being a peer today, or sorry, in America. Like when you talk about being a peer of the realm, that's like you are landed.
yeah. You're landed gentry, or like you're
You're a
made.
lord,
Yeah, you're
right?
made. You can also be made
Duke
into a
or
lord, and
okay,
then you sit in the House of Lords, which is a kind of a part of the legislative body,
right.
and passes bills after they go through the House of Parliament. So one can be made into a lord, and that is normally when one has done something that the current or just leaving prime minister likes particularly, and then the prime minister can submit a list to the queen to make that person, I guess to the king now, whoever, to make that person like a lord, and then they will then enter into the House of Lords, and also they'll have the word Lord before their name. Sir is more honorific. When one becomes a sir or a dame, it's just that they're knighted, and it's like it's a praise title, but it doesn't give them any
Okay.
political power.
Okay, it's just an honor.
It's
I
prestige,
see.
yeah,
All right.
yeah,
So Lord is more like that's a power play.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Often, like it's just insane. Like it's actually hilarious how people get into the House of Lords. I think David Cameron, David, the previous prime minister, made his wife's hairdresser. Well, it wasn't a lord. It was a what's the opposite of a lord? A baroness. I can't remember. Like the female equivalent for a lord. Late, I guess.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but like, yeah, you can get it for like any
But
fucking
now
shit.
hold on a minute. So wait. So but the House of Lords then like you're so
Yeah,
the House of Commons is elected, but the House of Lords is appointed?
yeah,
Oh shit. I didn't realize that. So the House of Lords, which has real political power,
yeah,
is merely like an appointed set of noblemen.
yeah.
Oh, okay. So you like y'all have less of a democracy than we do. Like, holy
To
shit.
an to an extent, often the House of Lords will be quite liberal in like stopping normally quite right-wing policies from getting through. But
Right, but that's
normally,
not. But sure, it might be progressive, but it's not.
but sure,
It's
sure,
not
yeah,
democracy.
no, it's
You know,
extremely
you
undemocratic.
just have
Yeah,
a beneficent oligarchy.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Well, my opinions of democracy. I've never argued that we have a very good democracy, but yeah, no, we don't. It's not. I think
Okay.
like
Yeah.
everyone
Yeah. Yeah.
forgets about it so much because they normally don't stop the
That,
bills that go like Parliament normally proposes bills and then the House of Lords are like fine. So people normally forget about like this undemocratic group of people because they normally don't like
they
put their
don't
heads
do.
above the
Okay.
parapet.
I see. See the I think in my primitive education, I was taught about the House of Commons and the House of Lords as being basically equivalent to like the House of Representatives and the Senate. But like that's very
Yeah.
different. Like ours might be based in part on yours, but like that's
Uh-huh.
very different because ours are all elected. Like I mean, to the extent
Yeah.
to which elections are actually meaningful here as well. But right, like
Mm.
okay, that's crazy though. Like you have a king
Yeah.
and queen or whatever, but like that's the least. The king queen part is like purely decorative. Like you actually have a
Yeah.
branch of government that is not elected at all, and like
Yeah.
a
I would a
legislative
very
branch of government. Yeah,
yeah, a very small branch of government that like can't come up with anything or like they can only pass or say no to a bill.
like
They
they have
can't,
basically they have veto power over your legislature.
yeah, yeah. That's yeah,
If
yeah,
they
yeah,
were, but
yeah,
my guess is like if they were to start using it a lot, then there might start to be agitation.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
all right, interesting. All right. So yeah, yeah. Go on with
I
your crazy knights of the literary realm.
okay, so yeah, this how do we get here? Oh, Sir
Sure, sure.
Vickers. Vickers. Yeah, so his argument actually ties back to a lot of like people used in the 18th century, which is like, oh no, they're just platonic, they're just friends. Which I love
Yeah.
this argument because like who else is writing 129 sonnets about their friend? Like, even if like he said, "Oh, we're just friends" in like every other sonnet, I don't believe him. Like, like that they're in love. Like, oh, like at least he's in love with his quote unquote friend. Like, this is a bizarre comment. So Vickers also says along this line that like there's no actual proof that this is a sexual relationship. I think this is like what I like to call like totally ignoring historical context argument, where like he says, well, there's no explicit references to sex, so they're probably not a sexual relationship. But like in Shakespeare's time, from what we read in the first article I sent you, it seems that though homosexuality wasn't seen as like a kind of, it wasn't seen as a culture that should be stamped out. It was more seen as a kind of sinful action, in the same way that sort of having sex with a prostitute and having sex with a man seem to be kind of similarly bad, like bad Christian irreligious actions that
Yeah,
like
but it
vices that,
would like go hand in hand. Like in a way,
yeah,
like
yeah,
the best counter argument that Shakespeare was not gay is that gay was not a meaningful category then.
yeah.
Like that
I don't
basically like
I think that's also
men
a bad
were
argument, but yeah.
sure, but like the argument that that Sandra Newman in the other article attributes largely to Michel Foucault, among other people, is that like having sex with men having sex with men was just thought of as
Mm,
like it was like there was a lot more much more restrictive sexual conventions in general, and like men often shared beds with other boys and men growing up, and there weren't the same people weren't uptight in the same way about physical proximity with other men the way that maybe Americans are today, for example. But
mm,
it was like kind of dipping into fooling around with other men was considered like a sexual excess. It was not considered like a, oh, you're signing on to be one of the gays. It was just like,
right,
oops,
right.
yeah, you did a little bit of that. Like the way like Stoppard's Wilde makes the line in The Invention of Love, where he says like the only things I learned at the only things one learns at Cambridge are rowing and sodomy. Like
Right.
like a standard British schoolboy joke, like, oh yeah,
Uh-huh.
good old sodomy, just like one of the things that happens.
Right, right.
And that to me, that has at least some legs to it as an argument. I don't know, like,
I think
yeah,
I I wonder about this argument because I think so. I think actually, let's get to it. So
okay,
I wanted to like complete my takedown of Vickers' argument, which
sure,
is
sure,
that
sure,
like historically, still homosexuality and pederasty, which is like falling in love with underage boys, underage using our current terminology, but falling
right.
in love with teenage boys in a weird platonic,
Again,
problematic way, whatever.
I was going to say platonic doesn't mean
As
what
it,
people think it means.
yeah.
Like, it's not, yeah,
But yeah, like influenced by Plato, that kind of way, that is still like looked down on. That's still an excess. So it's probably you're probably not gonna include outright references to this in your poetry unless you're like a libertine or in a great sort of situation of power. Like if you're Rochester, you can say, "And missing my whore, I bugger my page" or whatever. But
yeah,
even Rochester isn't writing 129 sonnets to his page. He's
right,
just
yeah,
making a kind of joke about his sexual excesses. Shakespeare is writing 129 sonnets to a fair youth, like a man, like it's a fucking man.
yeah,
He's definitely in love with him. Also, yeah, I find it strange that like if one is in love with another man but doesn't have sex with that man, that doesn't make him gay. That seems very strange to me. It seems like it's an interesting 20th century conception that like
right,
one is only gay if one enters into sexual congress with another like male or
right,
like
yeah.
man.
Which
Like,
is like by which logic, like Dante was straight, right? He
yeah,
not straight. He was what like
yeah,
gay for Beatrice or whatever. Like he
yeah.
never
It's
even like
very
laid a finger on her.
right, right. It's very odd. And I think I do wonder if this is like a defense mechanism people in like the 20th century have come up with to like hide the fact that they're like bisexual from themselves. Like if they fall in love with their best friend or something, they're like, oh, well, I'm not gay because like I haven't had sex with them. Like I'm just like we're just really close friends. I just love them platonically. Like
Yeah,
I
yeah,
do
yeah.
wonder if there's like kind
I
of a
don't.
modern
Do you? I
field.
mean, is that in circles in which people are debating Shakespeare? Do you think there's that much closeting today? Like there clearly are.
I think a lot less so.
Yeah, I mean, all right. So here's I'll try to give a devil's advocate argument for
Hmm.
like for resisting, I'll say, like outright
Hmm.
claims that Shakespeare was gay or that the sonnets are homosexual or whatever. I think like one fairly straightforward argument is just that it's limiting to say this is great gay literature because it's just great literature. It's like the reason these are not like great gay love poems is not because they're not gay. It's because they're just great love poems.
Okay,
The
let's
way like Sappho's love poems are not great gay love poems. They're poems by a woman about women, but they're just great love poems. Like
okay,
they transcend that subcategory.
let's do like a format where you like give me objections and then I rebut them because I
Sure,
think that'd be easier than like
you can rebut that. Yeah,
because I'd have to because if you give me like three or four, I'm gonna have to
yeah,
remember
yeah.
all of
All right,
them. And
go ahead and rebut that one.
I think like why can't they be both? Like why
Sure.
is that a
Yeah.
binary?
I don't think it's a binary. I mean, I think like you don't bother to say that Petrarch wrote like great straight love. I mean, I don't love Petrarch, but like you don't bother to say like Wyatt wrote great straight love poems. He just wrote great love poems.
Yeah, but that's because like straightness is like the normative idea of sexuality from our perspective looking back, right? So it's
Sure, but
assumed when
isn't it more inclusive to say these gay poems are just great love poems? Like
well,
why is it important to say like no they are gay poems? Like is that
I
an
think it's not
categorization?
important to say this every time, but it's important to recognize when you have when your narrative like normalizes the idea that love is like in essence heterosexual, and then there's like some deviation from that. I think it's
Yeah.
good to like demonstrate that like other that some of these poems aren't in fact like just that. Like if you say that these are love poems, I think everyone's going to generally assume the general assumption still, especially amongst like people not in my generation, which makes up most of the world, like people who aren't in my generation, the general assumption is when you say a love poem, you mean a heterosexual love poem. And like also Sappho's love poems are widely known to be gay. I mean, the word
Yeah,
Sappho and sapphic and lesbian
yeah.
like have entered into gay language.
That's
And
true.
and
Yeah.
yet Shakespeare's love poems aren't. And that seems very strange to me. That like we all
Yeah.
recognize that Sappho's love poems are still great love
I mean,
literature.
do you think if she had a colossal body of dramatic literature that like clearly transcended any one category that then accompanied her smaller body of lyric poems that were mostly gay, do you think we would still think of her as like gay old Sappho, or do you think we would?
I think then we'd have to say that the persona in those love poems is gay. And I'm
Yeah.
not against saying that the persona in Shakespeare's love poems are gay. All I'd like to say to that argument is that like this guy thought about, even if he wasn't actually in love with a real man, he thought about being in love with a man 129 times. So
Yeah.
I think in some sense mentally he was in love with a man. That doesn't
Yeah.
have to be a real person, but like mentally he entered into being like homosexual so much that it seems
Yeah.
quite hard to say that that wasn't a large part of like his internal landscape.
Yeah, I guess it's funny. Like I think of literature and especially theater and lyric poetry as being so gay as a default that I actually don't know that if you say love poem, I don't know that I mean, even if the great majority of people in the world are straight, like gay people are so disproportionately represented among great literature, like great lyric
Oh
poetry.
yeah.
Like it just
Well,
seems I actually don't even know that I think of it as being to me like the gayness of poetry is so native to it that I sort of I think I sort of reflexively just like already lump it all in together.
I agree with you there, but aren't you like centering your very like bubbled, very knowledgeable perspective? Like if you go out on like on the street, right? Most people have heard of Shakespeare's sonnets. I don't think most people know that like 129 of them are to a man though. That's what I'm
Yeah.
trying to say.
I mean, but again, like if they've read them, they do. Like, I don't know.
I don't know, like if they've read all of them and like
Right. Yeah.
attentively, yeah.
You could read 18 and 73 and not think that there's no explicit mention of those being about
No,
being
I think
men.
most
And
people do. Like most people read 18 and like compare love to a summer's day. I've even seen like television shows where like Shakespeare's depicted writing about a woman. And I'm like,
right.
do your research. Like this is about a man. Like no one knows. Like I don't think really
Yeah.
many people know this. It's fucking insane. And like a lot less people know Sappho, right? But all of the people who know Sappho,
They know
I
she's
think,
gay.
know that her
That's
love
true.
poems are
That's
gay.
true. Yeah, I mean, I think probably Shakespeare is just such a colossus to borrow one of his own images that he invented. I mean, he
Yeah.
like I think it's just hard to see him in any kind of perspective, and because the bulk of that reputation comes from the plays, just because there's so much
Yeah.
enormous body of great work, it's yeah, like the sonnets don't define his identity in the same way. But like when I was a when I was like 12, my dad gave me a novel about Shakespeare's life, and it was like the whole thing was about him having like threesomes with men and women. Like he was
Yeah,
like it was literally
that's
about
interesting.
like most of the book was he was having sex with a man, but then there was also this woman, and then things got complicated. Like literally, it was like the story of the sonnets.
Right, 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 right.
So I mean, to me, it's just like it's so much already part of all, and like even in his plays, like everybody's cross dressing, everybody's like accidentally kissing men, like it's all so gay. It's just like I don't know. It's hard for me to. It's to me like the the thing like what's so baffling is like getting up in arms about like no Shakespeare was straight. Like to me that's just such a weird hill to die on. But I also like where I'm somewhat sympathetic is like there's so much like Shakespeare's a whole like planet, and then to be like actually this is about waving a rainbow flag. If you're like all right, what, come on now, like that's what we're talking about here.
I'm
um
so wait, I don't. But like, what? Like, where did we go from? Like, where did we get to rainbow flags though? Like,
well I
what?
think like
What happened there?
oh, I just mean like where my I think my sympathies with the Vicar's response are sort of like I think his argument seems silly, and like that he's even making an argument seems silly. What I can sympathize with is what I assume to be his response, which is he read some essay or review where somebody probably said something kind of dumb, like said like importantly Shakespeare the important gay poet in a way that felt like it was it was diminishing what Shakespeare is actually about by saying like the important thing when we read Shakespeare is that he was a representative gay person. Like to me, like I can understand some frustration with that, not because Shakespeare wasn't super gay, but because like it just feels like a I could understand that feeling like an anachronistic privileging of identity in a way that feels very
Yeah.
21st century.
I guess there's two things here. There's
Yeah,
what I would like to think of as like gay emotions, to put it very crudely, and gay culture. And I
sure.
think like it seems to me like maybe some people are scared that somehow I'm trying to advocate for Shakespeare to be absorbed into like an LGBT whatever culture, right? When like
Right.
I
Shakespeare,
don't
war, hot pants.
yeah, like I don't give a shit about that.
Right.
I
Yeah.
what I'm interested is that like Shakespeare seemed to have very intensely gay emotions towards either fictitious characters or real people. Who knows? And
Yeah. There's tons of gay characters in this place. There's tons of like ambiguously gay
yeah.
scenarios. There's like, it's all like, again, like that was this, like the play where I like, as a 14-year-old boy, kissed like a 40-year-old man on the mouth in front of my eighth grade class was Midsummer Night's Dream, of course, because it's full of that stuff. Like that's all.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
it's interesting because like no one like I guess we don't have like a term for like a poet. We just say like a famous heterosexual poet, right? But no one like
Right.
claims that like if we just describe a poet as heterosexual, we're like take making them into like a good figure of heterosexuality, and then people get scared that like they're gonna be absorbed into some political cause or something. Like
No,
it's interesting.
I mean, I do think like a version of that that does happen sometimes is when particularly when a male writer's writing is taken to be, I mean, I hear people do this in even like classes. I hear people do this with Hemingway all the time, where they'll like read something of Hemingway's and they'll say like, all that's really happening here is we're seeing Hemingway exercise his own personal misogyny. And basically, they're
Right.
like Hemingway's just being a bad straight man, and like in that way it feels similarly diminishing. It's like okay,
Yeah.
calm down, like that is not a good summary of what's happening here.
Yeah. Yeah.
The thing like yeah, I mean again like Shakespeare's just so yeah, like the idea that like of that you would be upset by the suggestion that like to me it's like Shakespeare was like living in like crazy theater town. Like he was like I don't know, I take the sonnets at their word. Like I think he probably had sex with like a bunch of men and a bunch of women. And
Right.
like what do you what is what he was a theater guy. Like what do you fucking expect? Like I don't I was a drama major. Like what is the surprise here? They were all
I
like
do
cross-dressing and traveling and like sleeping in I mean, come on. Good Lord.
I do like respect more just like the 18th century poet who was trying to put together Shakespeare's collected works and went, I could not in good faith publish these sonnets. They're like horribly in love with men, so I'm not going to publish any of them.
Right.
Like
He was like,
I
these are clearly gay.
yeah, yeah. I respect that so much
Obviously
more than
gay
like
poetry can't
yeah.
be,
I
yeah,
respect that so much more than like saying, oh well they're not gay. At
right,
least
yeah,
you told the truth.
right. Like the loophole thinking that's like, ah ha ha, but did you know that it was actually quite normal to praise all of the body parts of your best friend while saying that you wished that he'd been born without a penis? That you, I mean, I did think like it's funny. I was taught in school. I remember studying Sonnet 20, and that is the one that is cited most as like having like the most explicit discussion of like
Yeah.
gayness as a question.
Yeah.
So I'll read it quickly. This is Sonnet 20. And just broadly, what this is talking about is saying basically like, hey, you're pretty like a girl. Like, too bad nature, who is a woman, and like nature is like a female Pygmalion. Nature is like a personified female goddess, fell so in love with you when she made you that she gave you a dick so that she could love you. But that was bad news for me because you're so pretty like a girl. So here's Sonnet 20. A woman's face with nature's own hand painted, hast thou, the master mistress of my passion. A woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change as is false women's fashion. An eye more bright than theirs, less false in rolling, gilding the object whereupon it gazeth. A man in hue, all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. And for a woman wert thou first created, till nature as she wrought thee fell a doting, and by addition me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose nothing. That one thing is a dick. But since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love and thy love's use their treasure. People talk a lot about like the puns on the word use and hue, and maybe those were pronounced differently. This is like, those are the parts of this poem that to me are sort of lame and boring. Like the line, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth, which to me is like a very cringy line. I do love a lot of this, like gilding the object whereupon it gazeth is like amazing. And there's a lot of really wonderful stuff in this poem. But it was funny, like being like reading this poem in high school, we were taught quite clear, like quite straightforwardly that like, at least in the context of this poem, this is a man talking about the beauty of another man and how it's so beautiful because it is so feminine. But then but then like, oops, turns out he also has a dick, and so I can't have sex with you. I can just love you, and then I have to sort of like vicariously enjoy you through the women who have sex with you, which is like a set of complicated feelings that you could describe as either like straight or gay. But either way, it's like clearly a man talking about the beauty of another man and like
Yeah.
closely, uncomfortably getting into all of the like nitty gritty physical sexual particulars of this.
Such a funny poem.
It's
I
it's like
do
a,
like
it's
I
like a
like the
very
prick pun.
goofy, like weird poem. It's like a weird argument.
Yeah, the prick pun is good though, right?
Oh
Like
yeah, no.
that's a good
Since
pun.
she pricked the out for women's pleasure, I like that. I think and even by adding one thing to my purpose, nothing is like har har. They like nothing was and one thing were funnier. But I think it's a man in hue, all hues in his controlling feels to me like it's like, all right, just like he's getting a little too clever. Like it's not he's not at his best there. Like
What do you think the hue is punning on?
what I read some commentary and it was saying that like that hues, because they may or may not, like it to me, the claim that was that hue may have been hues, that s the terminal s we pronounce as voiced, but they might have pronounced as unvoiced like the Germans do, and so hues might have been more pronounced like huse. And then they're also saying that hue might have been pronounced like you. But to me, like the further back you go in time, the more likely you are to pronounce an H. And even like the Brits still pronounce an H at the start of herb, right? So like to me, like that's a kind of a weak claim. But the argument is like there's a bunch of puns on hue and use and you. And use in this poem specifically there's a suggestion of sexual use. So
Oh,
to me,
okay.
like all of that, like punniness is like that's actually lame and boring. It's like that's not the part of this poem that I find interesting.
I don't find it boring, but I don't find it amazed. Like I like it, but I'm not astounded by it, if that makes sense, you know?
Yeah,
But
it also as like as you put it, like this is definitely like a like classic gay misogyny. Classic
yeah,
like
yeah.
you're like a woman, but you're not like a bitchy fake slut like most women. Like it's very mean.
Yeah, it's like when people like, I don't know, I can see like some being or like someone saying, well, like obviously he's in love with like women because he's saying he wishes the guy was a woman, but he's not quite
Sure, but
saying that,
like
is he?
yeah, I mean like
He's
it's
saying
not that
he's
he's
saying
like technically he is saying that. That's true. And yet, how many scenarios can you think of where one guy said to another, "You're so hot, just like a woman. God, I wish I could fuck you if because you're just like you're like yeah, in a very like in a restrictively straight culture, like yes, that is a like yes, he is technically saying that he's attracted to women. That is true. And yet, that is not the overall thrust of the argument.
it's not even that though. Like he's also saying he's as beautiful as a woman, but he's
But
not a
better,
woman
better
because
by
like
not
yeah,
being a
he's
real woman.
better.
Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So
No, yeah. I mean, if anything, this is like a this is this like flirts with being like a hymn to trans love. Right? It's like you're like a woman, but better. You have a dick.
yeah,
Um,
wait until they jump on that one. What's it?
yeah.
It's I think this is also kind of indicative of like if you break down the sonnet sequence into two halves. Don Patterson has, I'd say, a middling to okay book on the sonnets, which I think he's. I didn't learn that great amount of stuff from it. That like he was very entertaining with like his gloss on each sonnet, and he had some quite interesting things to say about like who Shakespeare was in love with and how he thought like Shakespeare had prepared the sonnets for publication because they're ordered in such a way that they work with like Elizabethan numerology, blah, blah, blah. But he did say something that I think is very true, which is that it seems to him that the first 129 sonnets are poems where love is haunted by lust and or its absence, while in the later sonnets dealing with the dark lady, its lust is haunted by love and or its absence. And I think this is very true that like when he gets on to talking about a woman, fictitious or real, he becomes
Mhm.
both much more self-hating and hating of the woman and much less interested in talking about love and much more interested in talking
Yeah.
about like the waste of shame, the waste of pleasure
Yeah.
and a waste of shame and stuff.
Because a
Like there's
lot, and
much,
that's true. Like a lot of the love poems of the first. I mean, again, it's not a half. It's like fourths or four fifths or something. But like, yeah,
yeah,
a lot of those earlier poems to the youth are, you could argue, like not they are love poems, and they're even like beauty, like love of beauty poems, but they're not especially sexual in aim. Like they'll even
yeah,
be sexual in a kind of an oblique way where they'll be like, you're so I mean, the argument of many of the early poems is like, you are so beautiful, you should have sex with some woman who can give you children because there should be more of you.
yeah,
So
yeah,
they are, you're right that like I don't know, yeah, I don't know if I follow Patterson's argument the whole way through, but I think there does seem to be, I mean, if anything, it seems like if I could imagine, if I could project a context onto here, it would be there's a lot of love and longing and desire for the fair youth, even if it's unclear if actual sex is happening. But then once the Dark Lady appears, it seems like sex is definitely happening. But then there's just a lot more complicated. So it may be like it was like there were fewer questions about like what exactly are we doing here when it comes to the lady, because what we're doing here is we're having sex. But
yeah,
then
yeah,
there were
yeah,
more questions about like what do we actually feel or care about. Whereas the
yeah,
love is very in evidence throughout all those earlier poems, but it isn't clear. Maybe they didn't ever, like, I could imagine a version of the background for this sequence in which the two men don't ever quite have sex, or they don't, maybe only late in the game do they. But there's certainly a lot of like longing and, pining throughout, which is
yeah.
again like every love story, like every
Yeah,
love sequence is like lots of pining and not enough sex.
yeah, and like it's definitely charged with like desire and I think erotic desire, but I think it's much more interested in examining maybe the emotion from which that desire stems, right? Which is like love, if you want to talk
Yeah.
about romantic love as a kind of like higher emotion, right? Than like the later
Yeah,
sonnets,
yeah,
which seem less interested in desire and more interested in like, well, they seem interested in desire, but talk about desire as a kind of a fever or an illness instead of kind of a side effect of like a greater,
yeah.
like bittersweet erotic love, right?
I mean, yeah, you could. It's funny, like if you want to make an argument against the Foucault claim that like sex between men was just a sort of a vice like any other vice, then it does seem as if the sentiment is like what I'm dealing here with this what I'm dealing with here in this with this man is love, but like when I need to get my dirty feelings out, I go to this woman. Like if anything,
Yeah,
like the
yeah.
sex with the woman seems like, well, that's where it's sort of easy to vent my, my bad humors. But like, I have I mean, in a way, like I do have it's like a more devout connection to this love for this man.
Yeah,
Um,
it's like the opposite of Rochester's line. He's like missing my page, I bugger my whore, right? Like
yeah,
it's
yeah.
that.
Yeah, he refers to the line. I think it's Newman talks about the term ingle, which is the term for a male servant that you just keep around for buggering. Which is, I have to say, ingle is like a really gross word. Like that's a real like good job, Brits. Like that's a terrible word. It's just so gross.
Yeah, it
I did
sounds sexy.
like to I these are not arguments against Shakespeare's gayness, but I did find like myself annoyed by some of the people arguing on behalf of Shakespeare's gayness. I found like more broadly, I found annoying some of Sandra Newman's linguistic tendencies where she, and like saying Shakespeare is gay is a an easy shorthand. Gay obviously would not be a term that even remotely would apply to that kind of behavior in that day. But like she goes further and she uses terms like she'll say like, oh, he was bi, in a way that feels like, well, what are like she refers to him as bi, she refers to him as gay, she refers to she uses, I'm trying to find like there are a few cases where she like uses very contemporary slang in a way that just feels like it just feels weird applying it there. Again, not because it's not sort of like technically chemically true, but because it just feels like it's sort of reading him in the wrong mood. We're just it he loved men. He seems to have had sex with men. It seems to have been something that was not incidental or accidental. Like it also is totally unsurprising because like look at all of poetry and playwriting throughout history, but talking about him in terms that are sort of specific to the way we talk about sexuality today and identity today feels sort of gross just because it feels like a weird it feels in the same way that I think like I understand the personal importance, but it feels like a little misguided to say like Pessoa was trans in a sort of straight like well whatever he was it was something that he understood in terms that he had and that like I don't know that like they would be really thrilled to get to borrow terms from us today to describe their experiences.
Yeah, I
I
get.
mean, again, like that's a very minor thing. That was the thing that annoyed me. Is the title of the piece is "Queering Shakespeare," which is like, all right, come on.
I think I agree and disagree with you. I think like I agree that like queer as a kind of term for a particular sexual zeitgeist that has like integrated with identity due to like oppression
Yeah.
is probably too far a step or like too simplistic to apply to Shakespeare. I don't get your annoyance with bisexual. In fact, I thought you'd prefer to call him bi than gay because bi surely is more truthful to what the sonnets are, which is like directed towards both genders.
Oh no, totally. So bi is more accurate denotatively, but
Yeah.
even like shortening bisexual to bi, it just feels so contemporary to today.
Oh, okay.
Just feels very much like the mood of calling Shakespeare bi feels like, well, what are we? I mean, sure, okay. Like this at a certain point, like it starts to feel like this is something that's more about you and your need to identify yourself in some way and take validation from Shakespeare's like falling into the same category as you rather than
Mm.
actually talking about what's happening in the poems. Like it's so crazy to me to like get mad at somebody claiming that Shakespeare was gay because like what like it's poetry. We're talking about poetry, remember? Like the gayest thing that there is. Like, like why do you care? But yeah, like I can understand being annoyed at some of the like sloshing, or I mean, in the same way that I think it is, I find it annoying. We were talking about like the dumbness of like, again, this is not what Shane did, but like one could imagine a poem that said like Odysseus owned slaves, canceled, trash, and like that would be a very dumb way to read the Odyssey. Not because Odysseus didn't own slaves, and not because he didn't treat his slaves horrifyingly, but because like that is like that's neither giving Homer credit for the complexity of his vision, nor is it like taking the value that there is clearly to be taken in reading that like astounding work of literature. But I think in the same way, it feels sort of dumb and cheap to like celebrate Shakespeare for being so gay. You're like, right, he was an immortal genius who probably was the greatest writer who ever lived. But like, yay, also celebrate him because he like falls into this identity category. Cool, great. In a way, like it would be like if like the bald guy movement were like really proud of Shakespeare for being bald. You're like, okay, fine. Like, sure, that's true, but like, what? Why are we talking about this?
Yeah, I guess so. I think I have like more emotional investment maybe in you because like I guess I do like the idea of like recognizing, I guess it does feel slightly comforting to know that like that Shakespeare was a genius and that he also fell in love with men and women. I guess like there's some amount of emotional comfort in that for me and probably for other people that
Sure, yeah.
like, but like, yeah, I can certainly agree that some commentators can take this to like an extreme where it's much more about them than it's about the poet.
Right.
And like, I guess maybe because I'm not particularly invested that much in queer identity or like queer culture, for
Yeah, yeah.
me, I don't particularly care about Shakespeare's
Sure.
relation to that. But like, I don't, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I see your point, I think.
Like when I was in high school, there was a tradition of the Gay Straight Alliance, which is what we called it back then in the Stone Age, which I was the president of my senior year, co-president of the Gay Straight Alliance. But like there was a tradition where they would put signs up around the school with the names of historical figures who were gay. And like I remember just finding that like a little tiresome. I mean, and probably it was did more good then than it would now. But I remember like one in particular felt weird to me, which is they would put up Socrates' name, say Socrates, gay.
Socrates.
And like to me, it was like both too big and too small. It was like, well, first of all, like if you really want to celebrate gay people, let's maybe not celebrate the guy who was like fiddling 14-year-olds. Like maybe like that's not the sign to hold up. But also like Socrates, like maybe the most important thinker in Western history, but also he was gay. Like, okay, sure, like fine. And I think
I mean,
maybe it's just like because I have spent so much time in like literary, poetry, theater world that I just, to me, it's just like such a like you have to like to pass through the doorway of caring about this stuff. You have to recognize that like things are going to be real gay in this room. Like
yeah, yeah.
it just like it's so already goes without saying that it then feels weird to me to like hang a lantern on it. But like sure, like I think again, like the thing that was touching to me about that trans letter was like, hey, this person in reading literature connected with it in a personal way that like helped her like understand the stuff she was reading and also understand herself and feel connected to the tradition. Like that's wonderful. And so like if you find that in reading Shakespeare and thinking about Shakespeare's writing being, you know, directed both to men and women, like if that helps kind of enlarge your own experience of the literature, like that's wonderful. But I just like
Hmm.
also sometimes people can talk about it in annoying ways.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I like how we just gone back to that poor woman's trans letter. I totally forgot about that for
Yeah.
like weeks.
Oh, here's the thing. I'm curious what you think about this because this was what actually annoyed me most. It was not
Yeah,
Sandra Newman, but one of the people who responded to Vickers. And
yeah.
this was quoted as I think in the Daily Mail. It's funny in one of these articles they misattribute it.
The Daily Mail is very stupid, so I wouldn't
Yeah,
find that.
the Daily Mail misattributes this to.
The Daily
Uh,
Mail's like our Fox News in the newspaper world.
okay, all right. So they misattribute this to Arthur Freeman, who wrote a much more like polite and gentle correction to Vickers, but they attribute this line to him. But I think it's actually an anonymous commenter who goes by the
Mhm.
name Professor Wells who actually said it. And this, I believe this is correct. I could be wrong, but I remember being a little confused reading these two articles. But I believe it's Professor Wells who says, if we insist on regarding the sonnets wholly or in part as a kind of long-term dramatic narrative, right? If we take as given the argument that he's making all this up as a persona, why on earth would Shakespeare choose so often to impersonate a pathetically aging, balding, lame, and vulnerable bisexual suitor, abjectly whinging about rejection and betrayal, unless the self humiliation that surfaces again and again through these particulars were both genuine and cathartic? That drove me fucking crazy. Because to me, like the argument there is basically, okay, well, if this is a persona, if he's putting this on and this is not actually him speaking, then why would he take on the persona of somebody who's sort of like aging and balding and bisexual and sort of this like whiny, sad guy? And like maybe the only reason I can imagine that he would take on that persona is so he could get some kind of catharsis out of the humiliation of it. To me, like that's the worst kind of like dumb psychoanalytical interpretation of literature. Like first it suggests like, oh, so whoever you are, Professor Wells, one thing I know about you is you're not a fucking writer. Because like anybody who has bothered to write anything knows that like you make all sorts of crazy choices about the premises that you take up when you're writing something, because the reason you take it up is because it makes the poem good. Like I don't think I don't when I read Shakespeare sonnets, I don't think, oh, he's definitely writing about a fictional persona. This can't possibly be him. Like, why would I think that? Of course, I assume that like probably a lot of this is him. Probably some of it is made up for the sake of making the poem better. Probably some of it is very direct from life. Like I assume, like most poets, he's mostly writing these short lyrics as from a mostly personal perspective. But also like the idea that like, oh, it's so unimaginable that he would take up an unattractive persona in writing these poems, and that the only reason he would do that is because he was working out something in this sort of S&M way to like gratify himself through his humiliation, through exposing his own. Like to me that's just like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like just like that's all to me, like that was as bad as the Vickers stuff. Like you were so beside the point here, just shut the fuck up.
Yeah, that was funny, and I don't like not a very clever understanding. Yeah, like done by someone who seems to have no insights into sort of the strange vortex of like making up personas.
Right. And like it's exactly the kind of argument that like where people make when they're like, oh Nabokov was clearly a pedophile. Because like why would
Yeah,
he write that? Why would he write that persona so well if he weren't himself a sicko? Like, oh Jesus
yeah,
Christ, shut the
it's
fuck up.
very stupid. It's
Yeah.
very stupid.
But
Yeah,
yeah, like
no, I
again, the crazy thing is just like why it like why wouldn't Shakespeare be gay? Like why in given all that we have, I mean, we don't know very much about him personally, but like what like I don't like why wouldn't any writer be gay? Like the it's just like I don't know. It just seems so strange to me to
Have you
like
seen
the idea
like
that like I would get mad if somebody were to write an like if somebody were to write like an essay about my writing and say like I think Matthew Smith is actually gay. I wouldn't be mad at that. Like I don't think I am, but also like why who cares? Like why would that not be like it's we're talking about poetry. Didn't you remember what this was? This was poetry. It's so gay. All right, that was my conversation with Cameron. There will be more of this conversation that gets into a whole lot of other juicy territories coming up on the Secret Show feed very soon. Right now, though, here is a preview of the most recent episode that's come up on the Secret Show, part of my conversation with Alice about a lot of sex-related problems. You can reach me, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. And with any luck, I'll be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.
So the last thing I want to bring up is this article that I sent you by my mother, Helen Garner.
Yeah.
She wrote this piece back in, I think, the late 70s. She used to teach at a high school around the corner. So she was a teacher. I'm not sure what class she was teaching, but at some point She's teaching high school, and at some point the subject of sex came up, and she decided, instead of trying to distract the kids from what they were giggling about, she was going to just talk to them really honestly,
Yeah.
really straightforwardly about what sex was. And what she got them to do was to write their questions on little bits of paper, bring them up, put them in the hat, and then she took them out, she read them out, and then she answered them completely honestly.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic piece of writing, I
Very
think.
entertaining. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she was later relieved of her job once it was published.
Yeah, I mean, not really surprising.
Can I read a little bit of it just
Please, yeah.
because
No,
I
yeah,
adore her?
they need to hear the actual, some of the
Yeah.
actual stuff.
I mean, I could almost read the whole thing because it's kind of short, but we are running a bit long. It's called "Why Does the Woman Have All the Pain, Miss?" So I'll try to start a little bit further in. They're waiting for me now and I pick up the first question. The question is, why does the woman have all the pain? Oh, Georgia, oh, Rita, I look at their open, eager faces and think of how their Greek fathers beat them for talking to boys in the street and how they are not allowed to go to church when they have their period. I spread out the papers and flick my eyes over their clumsy writing. How are sperm produced? Why do men love to bit ladies' tits? Why do men look at girls and want to feel them? What does it all mean?
That's, oh my
Why
God.
can't
That question is that's cut to the heart. That's half of
What
literature
does it all
is just
mean?
that question.
Why can't a lady have a baby when she's old? Does it hurt to have sexual intercourse? Sexual intercourse? I'd better start here. Before we start, I want to make you understand that the words some people think of as dirty words are the best words, the right words to use when you're talking about sex. So I'm not going to say sexual intercourse. I'm going to say fuck. And I'm going to say cock and cunt too. So we better get that straight. Is that okay? Without a word, Darryl reaches up from his desk by the door and clicks the lock shut. And away we go. Nope, fucking doesn't hurt. It feels marvelous. And I'm drawing awkward uteruses on the board and showing them on my own body where my uterus is and explaining what a clitoris is and what it's for and telling them that, no, you don't always have to ask for a fuck. That often just happens. Just happens, miss? Didn't your husband ask you? Miss, is it true that there's a hole you shit from and a hole you piss from and then another hole where you do it with boys? And then these are questions in all caps. Can you only fuck when you've got your period? What's a franger? Can you fuck every day? Should I stop there? It just goes on.
Wait, but what is a franger? I want to know.
Condom.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
And is perva is just like a pervert? Is that what that is? Because that comes up later.
Yeah, I don't know what a pervert is. That's like weird 70s slang that I've never heard before. I guess it's a pervert. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's a totally entertaining article, and she is very winning in it, and seems like maybe the ideal person to have fallen into this situation. I mean,
she's
fallen
so
into
fearless.
/ created this situation.
Yeah, no, she was like, all right, I'm bored. Let's do this.
Yeah.
She's such a fearless person, and when you read about this episode in the Yellow Notebook, she talks about losing a job and she just doesn't give a fuck. She's like, okay, I'm a writer anyway. It doesn't matter. But
and
yeah.
I especially appreciated. So what occasions all this is they're doing an ancient Greece assignment, and they open up their textbooks, and they're all these nude statues and urn paintings, and they have been predictably defaced by previous classes with lots of obscene addenda. And the kids are all laughing, and they're looking at, they all have these obscene drawings in their books. And then this is the part I think I really, really appreciated. She said, I realize that this is the moment I can't let pass. All the dreary arguments at staff conferences about the idea of sex education courses suddenly seems beside the point. So I say, look, the reason why people do these drawings and why we laugh at them is that sex is more interesting than just about anything else. And because most kids at school don't know nearly as much about it as they need to, do you want to talk about it? So that to me was that was the real heart of what she did, was sort of identifying this obvious truth that was being painfully ignored and then directly bringing it into the room for consideration.
Yeah. And then
It's-
one of the
yeah.
kids says, can we ask you questions? Any questions? Will you tell us anything we ask? And then
She
they get
immediately says,
scared.
yes, I will. Oof, boy, I would not have said yes, I will to that. I would have said, we'll see. I will try to answer all of your questions. because I was going to say they came up with some serious challenges, but like there's some questions they could have come up with. It could have gone a very different way.
But because they can tell that she's taking it seriously and she's not fucking with them, then they don't fuck with her.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, and I actually I really loved it. Ends on a wonderful note with the sweet nerdy kid comes up at the end of class. One kid dawdled behind, the one who always chats with me while the others play. He wanders up to the table where I'm sitting. Hey, miss, he says, pointing at the scattered pile of questions. Want me to help you destroy these? Which is so touching to me. That's like, oh, that's like these kids are going to be okay because of you. Like you've helped. So I mean, I think first, like it's just a totally delightful essay to read. Second, it's what seems to be the case is that this was an absolutely good experience for them. It was nothing but like helpful and informative for the kids and like good for her as a person and teacher and just generally like a good event all around. Also, clearly these kids were not getting the sex education they should have been getting. Neither did I at that age. I mean, or any
absolutely
age, really.
not. No,
so,
no.
and like not giving kids any sex education is just a really good way to make sure they learn it from weird places, which is what happened with me. And before learning a lot by doing, I had definitely like learned a lot about female anatomy firsthand in, late in high school.
Yeah.
And, and there's some honorable tradition to that as well. But so overall, I thought like, well, this was in itself a good event. She's wonderful. She seems like a wonderful person to have been the person to do this. And clearly this was much better than the alternative I experienced, the alternative many kids experience. Like, and that initial observation that like, hey, here's this thing we're all pretending isn't true. The reason that we all get so up in arms, but we get so excited about it is because it is actually extremely interesting and compelling and like central to the human experience. And there's a lot of ignorance around it. And so that then creates extra interest to it. I did have some like slightly nerdy, it raised for me some interesting, slightly nerdy questions about education. To hear the rest of that conversation, go to sleerickets.substack.com and sign up for the secret show. It's pretty fucking cheap.